In our last lecture, we looked at a number of approaches to the study of myth in general and ancient Near Eastern myth in particular. And we looked at the various rubrics or subjects under which ancient Near Eastern mythology has been studied in the past, under the rubric of philology or linguistics, under archaeology, or under religion and biblical studies. And I noted that the combination of these subjects, philology, archaeology, religion, can give us the yield of history. It can enable us to piece together the history of the ancient world. Today's lecture examines that history and investigates the historical context in which Egyptian and Mesopotamian myths were created and recorded. Conditions in both Egypt, the land of the Nile, and Mesopotamia, the land of the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, enabled the gradual emergence of urban culture in the centuries before 3000 BC. In both Egypt and Mesopotamia, we see in this period the beginnings of political organization, commerce, architecture, and writing. And I will be emphasizing writing throughout this and subsequent lectures because it's through writing that societies are able to become organized. Without writing, you can't really have an urban culture such as we know it in the ancient Near East. Civilization in both areas was based on a large population base with a steady and reliable food supply. You need to have enough food grown outside a city in order to support the people in the city and in order to enable their commercial and cultural activities. Religious systems and the development of myths were key features of these first societies, and I will outline towards the conclusion of the lecture a set of comparisons between Egyptian and Mesopotamian cultures, and then move to the earliest of the Mesopotamian cultures, the great culture of the Sumerians. Now, one often reads in reputable history works of the emergence of civilization in the ancient Near East. And one could understand this in two ways. Descriptive, that is, I'm going to tell you about the emergence of civilization in this place. One could also read it as an assertion that this is where civilization as we know it emerged. This is where we get the first cities and the first organization. So, my project in this lecture is to sketch out these histories and to compare them. In both Egypt and Mesopotamia, urban culture, the culture of cities with a food supply in a nearby area, develops over a period of time. It is not something that appears suddenly in history. And we can assign the period between 4000 BC and 3000 BC to this process in which we have the development of urbanism. This is preceded by a period from 6000 to 4000 in which, as the result of the Neolithic Revolution, which I will describe in a moment, people begin to live in large centers permanently. The Neolithic Revolution saw a gradual transition from dependence on hunting and gathering to dependence on food produced by settled groups engaged in agriculture. And it involved the domestication of plants and animals. Now, this transition, which has been documented through the archaeology of prehistory, occurred at a number of places in the ancient Near East. And one of the ways that this can be traced is from pottery finds, pottery shards. Pottery provides us with a kind of clock in which prehistory can be recorded. Before there was writing, again about 3000 BC, we have this long period in which culture is developing, and we can trace that development of that culture through the remains of pottery. The materials with which to make pottery, what do you need to make pottery? Water, clay, and some kind of fuel in which to bake the clay. You could also bake it with the sun, which they did. These were all in abundance in the ancient Near East. Now, in these periods, in the period of the Neolithic and the period of the Proto-Literate, we can trace the prehistory of Egypt and Mesopotamia and see smaller centers growing into larger ones. We can find evidence, mostly through grave goods, through what they buried, that they were growing wealthier or more powerful. And we can see early evidence of religious ideas. How, might you ask, can we see this evidence if we don't have writing? Before we have writing, we have markings, we have decoration, we have artistic attempts, we have the use of pottery made in a decorative fashion, and we have pictures on cylinder seals, tokens, and other decorative items. In this period, settlement became more complex, and the larger settlements, becoming urban centers, gained political power. Now, a feature of these centers was that there was a place for the ruler. Eventually, this would be a kind of palace. And there was a place for the god, a local god. So you could say there was a president's office and some kind of religious center. The palace was often at the highest part of the city or the center of the city. The religious center, the place where the god was served and worshipped, was sometimes next to the center, but often it was in a secluded place. The idea seems to have been that the gods need a kind of privacy, that worshiping the gods is a more private act, not something public like dealing with the king and the nobility. The Sumerians in southern Iraq are the first builders of these city-states in which we find temples and palaces, religious and administrative centers. Now, how this transition occurred from agricultural villages to towns to urban centers with thousands of people is something that we can trace through archaeology, through pottery, through early decoration, but it's not something we can get a very firm handle on. Of course, there are missing centuries in the account. By its nature, it's an elusive topic. There are many theories about it, and I will be sketching them. During the period in which these cities were developing, we can see something typical of all later civilizations. There are insiders and there are outsiders. And this is still with us. There are people with access to wealth and power. There are people without. So when you get cities, you get royalty, you get administrators, you get military, you get the police, you get religious functionaries. You have odd ones that we don't have anymore, such as sacred prostitutes, something they had many of in Mesopotamia. Well, these were all insiders of a kind. You also get outsiders. You have refugees, criminals, foreigners, prostitutes. So very early on, by 3000 BC, we have this very rich society with the ins and the outs. Now, myth, the subject of our series, can be a help in understanding this transition from settled village to town to city, because many myths refer to this transition obliquely. They don't do it directly. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, we read of Gilgamesh and his companion Enkidu. Enkidu comes from the wild, comes from the country. When he has to enter society, he must undergo a transition. Gilgamesh is a king. He symbolizes the urban. Enkidu is a kind of half animal who has to be, quote, civilized. And what does civilized means? It means going to the civitas, going to the city and becoming part of it. Some of the modern theories, not the mythic ideas, but the modern theories about how these centers developed, focus on economics. We have a surplus of wealth theory. Villages produce more food than they need. Individuals accrue wealth. We have a ruling class emerging. Some people are freed to do artisan work. People are freed to do religious work. We have hierarchy and stratification. and we have greater complexity. Religion is definitely a factor. Beliefs, local gods, as I said. A local deity meant that you had to have a local temple, and there were functionaries of this temple, and the god had to be served and often fed. That is, goods had to be given to the gods, and the temples began to accrue wealth. One theory is that of challenge and response. These continually growing complex organisms, towns, cities, required administration. The landscape of Egypt and Mesopotamia required administration. It was a challenge. That is, the land had to be irrigated. You had these great river valleys, and you had to control the water and control agriculture. So you needed administrators, you needed rulers. This idea of challenge and response is identified with the great English historian Toynbee and has been taken up by many other theorists and historians since then, including the great historian William McNeill of Chicago. So again, both in Egypt and Mesopotamia, increasing complexity, urban centers, and religious ideas. There has been much discussion about the relative development of Egypt and Mesopotamia. The scholarly consensus today is that Mesopotamian society and writing develops a bit earlier than Egyptian culture. Egyptian culture lags by a few centuries, and we can trace influences from Mesopotamia on Egypt, and then in a later period, influences from Egypt on Mesopotamia. There's a lot of reciprocity between these cultures. Now, I spoke about the idea that societies had to produce enough food in order to have an urban culture, and that irrigation was all important. Both the Nile and the rivers of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and the Euphrates, overflow their banks and deposit silt along the riverbanks. This means that you can grow crops. You can grow crops a number of times a year, and with that you can provide more than enough food, and you can engage in import and export of food. In Egypt, the overflow of the Nile was very predictable. It began in early summer and subsided in the fall. And the overflow of the Nile was, for the most part, a large-scale national story. So one centrally administered system of irrigation under the control of a king and his administrators was able to control this. In fact, it was necessary to control it. In Mesopotamia, the system worked somewhat differently. There, along the two rivers, you have regional inundations. Not everything happens at the same time. You have tributaries of the river, and control over irrigation and agriculture tended to be more local. This went along with the idea of the local god. Local ruler, local god. These local centers in Mesopotamia were organized into confederations, and by the middle of the third millennium, about 2500 BC, the Sumerians had approximately 30 such entities, emerging city-states under their control. Now, the differences between these river valleys is one factor in explaining the differences between Egypt and Mesopotamia. A second factor is the vulnerability of Mesopotamia to invasion. Mesopotamia can be invaded from almost any direction. That is, modern Iraq can be invaded. Egypt is relatively safe in that way. It's very hard to take over. And as I've mentioned in an earlier lecture, even when foreigners managed to come into Egypt, the vastness of the project of conquest meant that they were eventually subsumed into Egyptian culture. Think of Cleopatra and her relationship with Rome, and how Rome in Egypt becomes, in a way, Egyptianized. So we have the idea that Iraq, Mesopotamia is vulnerable, and that Egypt is relatively invulnerable. Historians and theorists of history like to speak of Egypt as a kind of optimistic culture. It's a culture that felt secure. It couldn't be overrun. The succession of Mesopotamian cultures are thought of as more pessimistic. And we will see throughout our course how this is reflected in myth. It's a generalization, but it's a valuable one, like many generalizations. Egypt was very wealthy. Well, this could make you optimistic, couldn't it? If you were very wealthy. It had access to mineral wealth and especially to gold, to the gold of Nubia, which means, in ancient Egyptian, the land of gold. Mesopotamia was not rich in minerals. It had to go to other lands to find minerals, and we will study this later in some of the mythic material. So, optimism in Egypt, pessimism in Mesopotamia. Another way of speaking about it is Egypt as closed. Well, this doesn't go along with optimism, but let me show you what I mean. Closed in the sense of complete. Egypt's self-understanding as a culture, here I'm speaking of the ancient Egyptian civilization, was that in the beginning of time, ancient Egyptian culture achieved a perfection in writing, in religion, in ritual, and in architecture. Think of the vast, great building projects. This perfection was a gift of the gods. Humanity, in its nature, can only descend from that perfection. Things were going to get worse. This, of course, is an easy prediction to make, as all cynics know, because things generally do get worse. But the Egyptians had this idea of early perfection and later degeneration. So their ideal was a complete and closed system. And this went along with their complete and closed physical geography. Yes, there was outside influence, but it could be limited. Mesopotamian cultures can be seen as more open to outside influence, sometimes by volition and sometimes against their will. That is, they were conquered by other peoples. And this also relates to cultural artifacts. Writing. Egypt used the hieroglyphic system in its various scripts, or its basic variation of hieroglyphic writing, for 3,000 years of history. Other cultures did not adopt Egyptian language and writing. It stayed within Egypt. The situation in Mesopotamia is very different. Other cultures use Mesopotamian cuneiform and write their own language in it. So again, the closed Egyptian culture, the open Mesopotamian culture. The optimistic Egyptian culture, the pessimistic Mesopotamian culture. The first great civilization of ancient Iraq, ancient Mesopotamia, was that of the Sumerians of southern Iraq. Their ethnic origins and the origins of their language remain a mystery. I've mentioned that this date of 3000 BC is when we can count the beginning of the writing systems and urban culture. In 3000 BC, there were some 10 of these emerging city-states. Later, the number would move as high as 25 or 30, that is, centuries later. Among them were cities later made famous through archaeology: Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, and others. Many of these cities were walled, and outside of the walls were the lands where food was produced for the city dwellers. This harkens back to our surplus of wealth theory. In the early third millennium, that is, between 3000 BC and 2600 BC, Ur was among the most powerful cities, and we'll see this reflected in myth. And about 2600 BC, power shifted to Uruk under the rule of the great king Gilgamesh, hero of the epic. And in an earlier lecture, I spoke of the transformation of this historical personage into a mythic personage. In the second half of the third millennium, from 2400 BC on, the Semitic-speaking people to the north and west of Sumer, the Akkadians, gained ascendancy over most of Iraq and absorbed Sumerian culture and religion, achieving a new cultural synthesis. The ruler associated with this conquest was Sargon of Akkad. That's about 2300 BC. And he too will become a figure of myth. So we have these two kings, Gilgamesh of Uruk, Sargon of Akkad, who were historical personages. We know of this from the archaeological record, but who soon became the subject of mythic tales. The Sumerians had very clear ideas about the importance of order and organization. One of their origin myths, titled Enki and the World Order, tells of the god Enki, E-N-K-I, who's the inventor and administrator god. This is a function that I think many groups, schools, and corporations would like to benefit from. That is, they might theologize this and say, we need an administrator god. Because in the Sumerian idea of religion, with its many gods, gods had functions. There was a creator god in many of the myths, but Enki was not one of these creator gods. He was the god who took what was created and he organized this. He did this both on the macro level and on the micro level. He organized both the physical, natural world, rivers and valleys, so that they could produce food, and the urban world, constructing the first cities. He organized physical reality into efficient categories. And when it came to humans, humans were created, according to the Sumerian myths, by some very strange devices, which we'll speak about later. Once they were created, their functions were assigned by divine order. And here I want to alert you to a similarity to things Egyptian. In Mesopotamia, in Sumeria particularly, we have a similar idea about the origins of culture, that the gods designate how things are organized and how humans should organize their activities. Very different than our Western idea of progress. Things are getting better. Things are getting more organized. Research the future will make life easier. This is a forward-looking idea. Notice the backward-looking idea, not backward, but backward-looking idea that says things were perfect once, and we need to maintain stability. So stability is a key idea here. This god, Enki, blessed the great city of Ur in Sumer. Ur, you are supplied with much water. May your divine laws be well directed. City whose fates have been directed by Enki, Ur, may you rise to heaven's heights. And throughout this series, we will see that the city of Ur, blessed by the gods, is going to figure in Sumerian and later mythologies. And I will remind you, it also figures in the controversy, a controversy we've referred to, about the Bible and ancient Near Eastern civilization. Because Ur is the city where Abraham's family comes from, according to the narrative in the book of Genesis. So here we find ancient Near Eastern references to Ur, and we find biblical references to Ur. Enki is the god who brings writing to humans, and writing enables organization. Without writing, the Sumerians and later Mesopotamians felt one could not have a stable society. And they tell many wonderful stories about how writing evolves. Now here too, to compare Egypt and Mesopotamia, they both had this divine notion of writing. In Egypt, the scribe god Thoth was the origin of all writing. In Mesopotamia, early Sumer, Enki was the origin of writing. So writing, along with the other arts, had to be delivered. Therefore, writing itself and the system of writing represented an idea of perfection. The job of the scribe in ancient Egypt and in ancient Mesopotamia was a very elevated one. It may not have been a very well-paying one. There are some very charming anecdotes in the ancient texts, complaints by scribes that they aren't making enough money. Well, this is something that one hears in the modern world about scribes and teachers. But the job had with it great prestige. And in a wonderful Sumerian account of a dialogue between a father and a son, the father, who's a scribe, tells his son not to chase money. The son, it turns out, has become wealthy through business, but to become a scribe, to carry on the traditions of the scribal family. Now, this prestige about the scribe is related to the preparation for the job. In a way, we might compare it to medicine in the modern world and to the number of years one has to study to become a physician. In ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia, it could take up to 10 years to learn to become a master of the scribal arts. These were very difficult languages, and they required a high degree of diligence to master them. There were academies that taught them. One would apprentice oneself to another scribe to learn, and often, as I indicated in the story of the father and the son, the scribal arts would be passed down. And where does the scribal art originate? It originates with the gods, not only in an abstract way, but in a concrete way. That is, the god Thoth in ancient Egypt actually has a set of scribal implements that he uses to write. The god Enki not only brings the idea of writing, he brings the technology of writing. Because writing, which was done in Mesopotamia with a stylus on clay, was a technological pursuit. It was done on tablets of clay, which had to be baked in the sun or in kilns, and then these were preserved. In fact, it was so technological that there were some things that the scribes and the people in the scribal academies did that mystified students of the ancient Near East for a long time. One of the most charming problems was making envelopes. Many of you may have seen in museums the small Mesopotamian tablets on which the cuneiform writing appeared, with the wedge-shaped writing. Sometimes when a royal letter was being delivered, the scribes, after writing the letter on the clay, would take another set of clay, another set of materials, and shape an envelope of clay around the letter. This was to ensure privacy. So in order to get to the letter, you had to break the envelope. Actually, you couldn't steam it open, so it's a better system of security than we have today. I recall as a graduate student reading that some modern scholars were mystified by how they made these envelopes without getting the envelope to stick to the letter. And I was heartened to read a few years ago, as often happens in the history of science, that someone was brave enough to start investigation into this problem on their own and not rely what was written in the books. And they actually tried to do it. And they found that it worked pretty naturally. If you baked the one on the bottom, the letter tablet first, and then put the clay around it and left some space, you could create an envelope. It wasn't some high-tech idea. So this is a vote for going back and doing the experiment. My point, the scribal arts were an elevated art, and they were the gift of the gods. In this lecture, we have outlined the beginnings of ancient Near Eastern civilization, and thus of all civilization, and looked at the culture of the Egyptians and the Sumerians. We compared their respective geography, irrigation systems, building materials, and vulnerability to invasion and conquest. We moved to a survey of the Mesopotamian city-states and focused on the Sumerian idea of an organized society. And we focused, as we will throughout this series, on the idea that writing and the scribal arts enable the emergence of civilization. To be a scribe in these ancient cultures was a job of great prestige and one well rewarded, not financially, but in terms of social status and status within the nobility.